The Bay of Pigs echo, shadows on a new presidency. The White House, 1962, did not echo with the new frontier optimism advertised on television. It resonated, instead, with the ghost of a military failure that clung to President John F. Kennedy like a persistent cold draft. The disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion of April 1961. The failure was not merely a diplomatic embarrassment. It was a deep psychological wound. Kennedy, just a year and a half into his presidency, was still learning the difference between political calculation and existential command. The failure in Cuba, where a brigade of CIA-backed Cuban exiles was swiftly crushed by Fidel Castro's forces, had severely damaged the administration's credibility both abroad and, more importantly, within the Pentagon and the intelligence community. The older guard, the generals who'd served under Eisenhower, viewed the young president with a mixture of skepticism and ill-concealed condescension. They believed Kennedy had lacked the resolve to commit the necessary military force, viewing his caution as weakness. This constant internal self-scrutiny created an atmosphere of tense self-scrutiny within the Oval Office. Every subsequent foreign policy decision was filtered through the lens of Bay of Pigs shame. The president was determined never again to be caught off guard, to never again rely solely on the flawed, often bellicose advice of the established military and intelligence hierarchies. He had learned the harsh lesson that in the realm of global power, trust was a luxury and information was the only currency. The failure had cemented his distrust of groupthink. Kennedy began systematically creating a diverse, smaller circle of advisors, his ExComm, Executive Committee of the National Security Council, including his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, Attorney General, who offered a valuable blend of personal loyalty and ruthless pragmatism. The president sought counsel that challenged the monolithic conventional wisdom of a military establishment eager for decisive action. He had seen where decisive action, unchecked, could lead. Cuba, therefore, was not merely a thorn in the side, it was an open wound that bled political capital. The ongoing, complex efforts to destabilize the Castro regime, collectively known as Operation Mongoose, were a direct response to this lingering sense of humiliation. These covert operations, ranging from petty sabotage to elaborate assassination plots, often involving methods that now seem absurdly ill-conceived, like exploding cigars, kept Cuba perpetually active on the president's agenda. While they yielded no decisive results, they signaled to the Kremlin that the U.S. would not simply tolerate a Soviet-friendly communist state just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. This tension, fueled by the shadow of the Bay of Pigs, provided the psychological and political backdrop necessary for a far greater, unforeseen crisis. It established a precedent. Cuba was a non-negotiable threat that the U.S. would address with lethal seriousness. This historical context is crucial, for when the true crisis arrived, Kennedy's previous experience mandated a radical shift in leadership style. He would not allow himself to be cornered again. He would demand proof, weigh moral implications, and most importantly, keep his options open until the absolute last moment. The quiet, lingering failure of 1961 was the invisible edge that sharpened his focus for the coming nuclear storm. The silent surveillance, the U-2 and the lens of discovery. The discovery began in the cold, unblinking eye of a camera lens, 30 years after the World War that had introduced aerial reconnaissance. The instrument was the Lockheed U-2 Dragon Lady, a high-altitude surveillance aircraft capable of flying above 70,000 feet, an altitude impervious to contemporary Soviet and Cuban surface-to-air missile defenses. The U-2 missions over Cuba were routine, part of the continuous monitoring dictated by the post-Bay of Pigs paranoia. The pilots, often lone figures encased in bulky pressure suits, were flying delicate missions that bordered on the surreal. Up in the jet stream, the curvature of the Earth was visible, and the world below was a silent, sprawling map. Their primary payload was the Hicon B-79 camera system, a marvel of Cold War engineering that could photograph a license plate from such heights. The specific mission of Sunday, October 14, 1962, flown by Major Richard S. Heiser, was initially unremarkable. Heiser meticulously flew his prescribed route, enduring the extreme cold and the isolation of high-altitude flight, photographing military installations across the western half of Cuba. The film canister was immediately flown to Washington and rushed to the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Windowless Warehouse in central D.C. There, the photographic interpreters, a team of highly trained analysts, often young men and women with specialized geographical expertise, began their painstaking work. They worked with powerful stereoscopes, meticulously comparing the new imagery against previous coverage. The terrain below was rendered in 3 dimensions, allowing them to measure minute changes. On Monday morning, October 15th, the analysts, led by Arthur Lundahl, focused on a specific remote location in western Cuba. What they saw was initially baffling. There were complex geometric construction patterns that did not conform to the known layout of standard Soviet anti-aircraft sites. They identified unusual canvas-covered trailers and, most tellingly, long, narrow trenches that suggested launching pads. The moment of confirmation came when a young analyst named Sidney Drell identified a long, cylindrical object partially covered by camouflage. By meticulously measuring its dimensions against the size of nearby vehicles and barracks, using the highly precise metrics of the U-2 camera, Drell confirmed the object was nearly identical in size to the Soviet medium-range ballistic missile, the SS-4 Sandal. This missile had a range of approximately 1,100 nautical miles, capable of reaching Washington, D.C., and most of the eastern half of the United States. The NPIC analysts immediately prepared their final classified report, highlighting the irrefutable evidence Cuba was becoming a forward-deployed nuclear launch platform. The photographs, initially mundane strips of film, were now the most critical. Across the globe, in the vast, imposing Kremlin, Nikita Khrushchev viewed the ongoing Cuban situation with a complex mix of strategic calculation and personal pique. His primary motivation was the vast nuclear missile gap that heavily favored the United States. The U.S. had a massive advantage in intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and had placed their own intermediate-range Jupiter missiles in Turkey, practically on the Soviet Union's border. For Khrushchev, placing missiles in Cuba was a necessary bold move to instantly achieve nuclear parity and remove the humiliating imbalance. We must face the fact that the enemy has surrounded us with military bases, Khrushchev had reportedly told his inner circle. If we put our missiles in Cuba, we will have done the same to them. They will have to swallow it. The operation was codenamed Anadir, after a Siberian river, intended to deceive Western intelligence into believing the massive sea lift was merely a transfer of agricultural equipment or Arctic supplies. It was a masterpiece of secrecy and logistical deception. Thousands of Soviet troops, engineers, and technicians were transported across the Atlantic on civilian-painted cargo ships, hidden beneath timber and grain. The launch equipment, the very SS-4 and SS-5 missiles capable of incinerating American cities, was disguised and moved under the cover of darkness and tropical rain. Khrushchev believed 2 things. First, that the missiles could be operational before the Americans dared to act, and second, that Kennedy, scarred by the Bay of Pigs, lacked the political backbone to escalate the situation beyond diplomatic protest. He was playing a game of nuclear poker, betting the fate of the world on Kennedy's presumed caution. The primary goal was not to launch a war, but to radically shift the balance of power at the bargaining table, forcing the U.S. to withdraw their Turkish missiles and, crucially, to pledge never to invade Cuba. The defense of Fidel Castro's revolution was a secondary but politically vital motivation. A communist victory in the Western Hemisphere was an ideological triumph that Khrushchev could not let fall. The risk, however, was monumental. Khrushchev had circumvented his own Politburo's usual cautious vetting processes, making the decision almost unilaterally. The moment the missiles were detected, the entire operation transformed from a bold strategic move into the most dangerous confrontation in human history. The secrecy that had protected the deployment became the very factor that ensured American fury, confirming Khrushchev's actions as an act of bad faith and direct aggression. His gamble was now fully exposed, resting precariously on the nerve and restraint of a young American president he had fundamentally underestimated. The White House Situation Room, Tuesday morning, October 16, 1962. The atmosphere was thick with disbelief, fear, and a terrifying sense of inevitability. McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor, delivered the news to President Kennedy, irrefutable evidence of MRBM sites in Cuba. The Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM, was immediately convened, comprised of the President's most trusted advisors, including Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, CIA Director John McCone, and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. The central drama of the EXCOM meetings, which lasted for the better part of 13 days, was the battle between the Hawks and the Doves. The Hawks, primarily the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or JCS, and former Secretary of State Dean Acheson, argued for decisive military action. Their calculus was simple: destroy the missiles before they become operational, demanding an immediate surgical airstrike on the missile sites, followed possibly by a full-scale invasion of Cuba. General Curtis LeMay, Air Force Chief of Staff, aggressively pressed for this, telling the President, "If you decide not to do this, Mr. President, I will tell you you are in an almost as disastrous a spot as was Great Britain at the time of Munich." The military view was monolithic. Weakness invites attack. Strength demands immediate, overwhelming force. The Doves, led by Robert McNamara and the President himself, along with the President's brother, Robert Kennedy, argued for restraint. McNamara was quick to point out that even a surgical airstrike could not guarantee the destruction of all missiles, particularly those that were mobile or hidden. A single surviving Soviet missile could mean the destruction of an American city. He argued that an airstrike would be seen by the Soviets as a Pearl Harbor-style attack, virtually guaranteeing a Soviet response in Berlin, Turkey, or Cuba itself, escalating the crisis instantly to a full nuclear exchange. The President, acutely mindful of his Bay of Pigs error, repeatedly challenged the JCS on their certainty of their intelligence and the potential human cost. He recognized that the ultimate power lay not in the missiles themselves, but in the perception of control. To lose control, to surrender the decision to the momentum of military action, was to risk everything. The EXCOM meetings were characterized by intense, unstructured debate. The President often absented himself to allow his advisors to speak more freely, listening to the recorded transcripts later. This unorthodox method revealed the true personalities and biases in the room. The ultimate solution that emerged was the naval quarantine, deliberately called a quarantine rather than a blockade, to avoid the international legal status of an act of war. It established an undeniable red line on the sea, forcing Khrushchev to choose whether his ships would physically challenge the U.S. Navy. It bought time, preserving the diplomatic option that Kennedy desperately needed. The decision for the quarantine was finalized on the evening of October 21. Kennedy had successfully resisted the immense pressure for immediate war, choosing a calculated strategic defiance that would dominate world news and global fear for the next 6 days. The decision for the quarantine was not made lightly. The ExComm systematically examined the 4 principal options, applying a chilling calculus of risk to each. Do nothing, or diplomacy only. This was dismissed immediately. To allow the missiles to become operational would permanently alter the geopolitical balance, rendering the U.S. vulnerable to nuclear coercion and severely damaging NATO and international confidence. Surgical airstrike, the Hawks' preferred option. The risk was the guarantee of a Soviet counterstrike, possibly in Berlin or Turkey, and the high probability of missing mobile launch units. Initial death tally, unknown, but likely guaranteeing a major war. Full-scale invasion. This would involve massive casualties, certainly triggering Soviet retaliation against U.S. forces or NATO allies, and almost guaranteeing that Soviet field commanders in Cuba, authorized to use tactical nuclear weapons against an invasion, would do so. Initial death tally, hundreds of thousands. Naval quarantine, blockade. This was the chosen path. It established an undeniable red line on the sea, requiring Khrushchev to make the next move without involving immediate bloodshed on land. It provided a delay, a desperately needed moment for private diplomatic negotiation. The fundamental calculation that drove Kennedy was the probability of an ICBM launch in the case of a military attack on Cuba. Every military advisor, save for the most cautious, underestimated the risk that Soviet field commanders in Cuba were already authorized to use tactical nuclear weapons in the event of an invasion. Therefore, the quarantine was chosen because it was the only option that avoided the immediate, irreversible act of killing Soviets on Cuban soil. It preserved the slender possibility of a negotiated retreat, keeping the crisis within the realm of politics, not physics. The fate of millions rested on the belief that Nikita Khrushchev, however erratic, was also a man who feared the atomic void. As the military prepared for the quarantine, the political and personal war was being waged behind the scenes, largely orchestrated by Robert F. Kennedy, the president's younger brother and closest confidant. Bobby Kennedy, or RFK, was the crucial hinge between the public display of strength and the private desperation for peace. RFK's role was twofold. First, he was the president's devil's advocate within ExComm, possessing the unique ability to challenge the military without fear of contradiction. His moral voice, focused on the sheer immorality of a preemptive strike, was powerful. He argued passionately against the surgical airstrike, calling it a Pearl Harbor in reverse, a morally indefensible act that would forever stain the American legacy. Second, and far more vital, he served as the secret back channel to the Soviet leadership. While official diplomatic cables flew between Washington and Moscow, Bobby Kennedy maintained a covert dialogue with the Soviet ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrynin. These meetings were conducted under immense pressure, often late at night, and in absolute secrecy, bypassing the slow, formal, and often aggressive State Department bureaucracy. On Friday night, October 26th, when the crisis reached its terrifying peak, with Soviet ships nearing the quarantine line and U.S. preparedness at DEFCON 3, Defense Readiness Condition 3, RFK met Dobrynin at the Justice Department. It was during this meeting that RFK delivered the private personal message that would save the world.
He affirmed the U.S. would not invade Cuba if the missiles were removed. And then came the crucial concession, the sweetener that could not be part of the public record. He assured Dobrynin that the U.S. intended to remove its obsolete Jupiter missiles from Turkey soon anyway, and that while it could not be part of the public deal, it would happen swiftly after the crisis ended. This private concession was the key to unlocking the Soviet position. It allowed Khrushchev to claim a victory, the removal of NATO missiles near the Soviet border, and justify his retreat from Cuba to his own skeptical Politburo. The crisis was not resolved by public posturing, but by a quiet, trusting exchange between two men, brokered by the fierce loyalty and unconventional diplomacy of the Attorney General. RFK's willingness to bend the formal rules of statecraft and engage in personal diplomacy at the highest stakes proved to be the invisible, saving grace of the 13 days.